Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the day that winter decided to finally make an appearance here in Massachusetts. And thank you to Professors Dugdale and Siegel for being with us. Now, to situate us in the conversation and to introduce yourselves a bit to the audience, our first question would be, why does death and dying interest you as a subject of study? And either one of you can go first.
Okay, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for organizing. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you and talking with you about death, of all things. So death interests me as a topic for a lot of reasons. It's one of the few human universals, and as such, it's kind of a portal into problems and issues and situations that we study in a field called existentialism, which is the study of problems that you have just by virtue of existing as a human. And so some of these problems are intrapersonal, from a first-person perspective, as when we think about our own death. Some of the problems are interpersonal, as when we face losses from people who will tear a hole in the fabric of our lives when they go. And then there are political problems that we face by virtue of living in community with other people, in public spaces, sharing spaces with people we might never meet, but on whom we're interdependent in various ways. And death poses different sorts of problems in these three different contexts, but they're all kind of universal problems. And so by studying it, it is a way to connect to everybody. There are also, I'm a philosophy professor, and there are a number of kind of historic puzzles about death that arise in a different part of philosophy, not existentialism, but what they call metaphysics, meaning they're just sort of puzzles some people become fascinated by. Like, for example, why do we feel, anxious or worried or fearful or bothered by our own death or the death of other people, the prospect of those things, but we don't feel quite so exercised about people who have never existed, or all sorts of possible people, who never exist. But we sort of don't seem to have the same attitudes about that. So that seems like a sort of a puzzle thing you could ask about. Why is it different? Then there's the question of why should death, the state of being dead or the prospect of that, bother us if we don't have any experiences of it? And so this is another thing people have talked about. And then there's the question of when does death happen? So, all sorts of difficult, non-straightforward questions about, when does life begin? Well, same thing as when does death begin? Mm-hmm. When is somebody really dead or not? So all these things are sort of metaphysical questions. Personally, I myself have never quite felt captivated or fascinated or hooked on those three problems that I just mentioned, the sort of metaphysical ones, though people are, I get very hooked on certain other philosophical problems that have certainly shaped my life and my work. I don't get personally so much hooked on those, but people do, though those questions sort of come at it, you have to have a certain detachment from lived experience, whereas personally, I'm more interested in the first set of questions about politics, about interpersonal relations and personal ones. So those are some of the roots that I take into this topic.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a physician and I come at this topic less philosophically and sort of more through the applied route. I started thinking a lot about death when I was early in my medical training and realized that we had large numbers of patients in the intensive care unit whose vital functions we could maintain quite well, and yet it was to no end. Everyone knew they were going to die. Everyone knew they were never going to come off of the machines. Everyone knew that they would never leave the hospital again, and yet we continued this sort of very aggressive, intensive life support. And I started wondering if there was a better way to help people think about their mortality and prepare for it. So that they wouldn't end up in these sort of horrible situations that they regretted. Many times family members would come to me later and say that they wished that they hadn't had to go through that with their loved one. So I, very early on in my medical training, started thinking about this question of what is the best way to anticipate our mortality and in fact prepare for it so that we could avoid some of these horrible situations. That was coupled with a general ease that I felt with the topic of death because of how I grew up. So I grew up in a family where we sort of talked about death now I don't want to say all the time, because it wasn't like we, were morbid. At the same time, my grandfather had been a bomber pilot in World War II, had an aircraft failure when he was in flight school, so had one bad crash and was hospitalized for several months with a fractured pelvis. Was supposed to be honorably discharged and actually asked to go back in to fight, and went into the war and then was shot down over Germany and was taken as prisoner of war. And then if any of you seen the movie The Great Escape? Yeah, so my grandfather ended up being a prisoner of war at the camp where the Great Escape had just happened. And so because all of these prisoners had successfully escaped, they really clamped down. So he had this kind of brutal prisoner of war experience. And survived that, and ended up living for many years, far more years than any of us anticipated. But because of those early experiences as a young man, my grandfather kind of talked about death very frankly. One of the first things he did after the war was, besides marry my grandmother, he purchased cemetery plots. That was like one of his first items of business, because death could come at any time, and you need to be prepared. And he was on had regular coffees and lunches with the undertaker at the local funeral home. And if one of the grandchildren got a tattoo, he would threaten to write them out of his will. So he was always sort of talking and joking. He was a very funny guy too, so talking and joking with us, but always with reference to the fact that we are mortal, that we will die. We face finitude as human beings. So that, for me, death was kind of destigmatized. It was not scary. It was kind of just, it was part of life. And so then as a doc, I thought, wow, if my patients are dying these deaths they wish they weren't dying, is there a way that we could do work earlier so that doesn't have to be their fate? And your third metaphysical question that you brought up is, when does death happen? So I'm also a medical ethicist, and that's something we talk about all the time. And in fact, Harvard is the place where we came up with a new definition of death, right? In 1968 is when we came up with the brain death criteria. I say we, I mean you, Harvard people. All of you in 1968 came up with the brain death criteria, but why did we need a different way to understand what death was? We know that you're dead when your heart stops beating. Why do we need to be able to say that you're dead when you're brain dead? Because we can get organs for transplantation. Mm-hmm. And organs for transplantation do keep people alive. It's also incredibly lucrative for a healthcare system. So there are these different ways of thinking about our definitions of death, because different things motivate them. Mm-hmm. So there are the philosophical, metaphysical questions, mm-hmm. and then there's the very practical, mm-hmm. pragmatic, what drives a healthcare system, mm-hmm. Sorts of questions that I also think about.
Yeah, the metaphysical questions are sort of so challenging to answer that on some views, some kind of meta-philosophical views, there are only pragmatic questions to them. So you could come at the questions thinking, I want to find the answer that exists out there independently of us. But on some views, and you see this both with questions about life and death, there isn't really any kind of purely metaphysical, non-practical answer. And so that makes the metaphysical questions ultimately questions of value. There's economic value, but much more importantly, there's sort of human value, mm-hmm. And both ends of those questions.
And Professor Dugdale, you share that story about your grandfather in your book as well. And so I'm curious, for someone who's so important in your life, do you find his experiences, the things that he taught you, shaping the way you approach death as an academic, as a doctor, not just as an individual?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I think that, so I'm a primary care doctor. I've had thousands of patients come through my office. And one of the things that Medicare requires of a primary care doctor is that at the annual visit, we talk about end-of-life concerns. And in my waiting room, the patients who are there for an annual, they have some questions to answer while they're waiting. And one of those questions is, would you like to discuss end-of-life concerns with your doctor? And everyone invariably checks no. They don't want to talk about it. That's just what they think. They don't want to talk about it. So then they come in, I look at their sheet, I write books on death. It says, no, I don't want to talk about it. And I say, so Miss Smith, not really Miss Smith, but Miss Smith, you checked no, so we don't need to talk about end-of-life wishes, but just one question. It's flu season. if you get too sick that I can't talk to you, who should I call? Who should I rely upon to make medical decisions for you? And then that slowly opens the door. And interestingly, out of the thousands of patients I've taken care of, I would say fewer than 5 have really refused to talk about death. And so how does my grandfather play into that? My grandfather made it a conversation topic in a way that wasn't scary, and in a way that we could, joke and laugh, and we could also be practical. Just talk about the cemetery plots. What do we need? What do we need to get in order? And so that's the kind of approach I've tried to bring with my patients. Let's just talk about who I'm going to call if you get too sick. Okay, you want me to call your partner? Fine. Does your partner know how you feel about engaging technology if you're really sick? Would you want to be on a ventilator? Have you talked about that? So you can slowly move into these very practical questions, which I would say is only the start, because then, as I talk about in my book, the kind of practical nuts and bolts thing of the hospital is really just a tiny piece of what it means to die well, right? Dying well and living well really are on the same continuum. And so you can gradually go deeper and deeper, especially in primary care where I know my patients over many years. So I think the taking away the scariness of it all is what I've tried to, and a little bit of humor from my grandfather.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we can move on to the next question, where I think a lot of us in the room might be curious about. Death can often seem remote to us, particularly, but not exclusively for those of us who are young college students. And should we leave it that way, or should we be grappling with this concept of and the reality of our death, and why?
I'll start with that. I think that we can draw an important distinction that comes through very clearly in the phenomenologist philosophers who wrote about death, and that's the difference between having death in the background of your consciousness and having death in the foreground of your consciousness. So the foreground of your consciousness, it's a theme, it's what you're focused on, it's what you're thinking about. And so when we ask, should I think about it or should I go about my business, we're asking, should I have it as a theme, as a topic? Should I be focusing my attention on it? Whereas the question of whether it should be in the background of consciousness, it isn't even a question, because it always is in the background of consciousness, or so these philosophers, I think, compellingly argue. In what way is it in the background of consciousness? And here's where things get complicated, but I think they can be explained, which is that if you think about anything you do, any activity takes time, but any activity has a temporal arc to it. So having a calling, that is a temporal arc of a life. Going to college, that has a temporal arc with a sort of endpoint, natural endpoint. It has completion conditions when you finish college. Looking at an artwork, or reading a great book, or poem, or philosophy or something, that has no natural endpoint, but has a temporal arc nonetheless. It doesn't end, but it structures your activity so long as you're doing it. And then those are sort of, anything you do has this temporal structure, and our sense of what we're in the course of doing, what we're in the middle of doing, what we're finishing doing, those are extraordinarily orienting for our lives at all sorts of levels. So if you think about, you're getting ready to go out to a movie with a friend, and you know how some people take a long time to get ready? Some people take less time to get ready. And if you're friends with someone, you hope that you're temporally compatible. Otherwise, it gets annoying if you're taking too long, because we walk around with a sense of how long certain activities should take. So I'm trying to give you these mundane but also grand examples so that you can see how it's completely unavoidable to have temporal structures orienting anything you do that has meaning, whether it's a mundane thing like going to the movies or a life-orienting thing like having a calling. Okay, so now what does that have to do with death? Well, what death does is it disrupts all temporal orientations, because in death there is no more temporal orientation. That is the end. There is nothing more to orient you. And that is why it is so terrifying. That is why everybody checks no on Dr. Dugdale's box, because we sense, we know, we feel intuitively how disorienting and disruptive it is to think about that. And that fact can be exploited and is exploited in politics sometimes. If you force people to think about death by imposing possibilities of violence all the time, you can manipulate their fears, you can disorient them, you can paralyze them, you can make them feel, I have to just do this immediate thing because, this thing is looming over me. So what should you think about? Now, people your age who are sort of rightly focused on futurity and on your role in determining what are these temporal arcs going to be. Should you think about death, we can use our distinction to disambiguate between should I thematize it and think about it all the time, or should I have it in the background? Have it in the background, it already is. Thematize it? No, don't thematize it. Don't think about your death. Don't, because you're already answering to it by focusing on the values that are shaping your decisions about what you're actually going to do. So in a way, you're already answering to the fact of your mortality just by asking the questions about what is worth it for you to do, what is valuable for you to do, and why.
So I have been so excited to have this conversation on this question. I have lots of questions. Let me just start with one. I want to take 5 on this point. So Kierkegaard talks about death as a threshold, right, between sort of life and uppercase life. Mm-hmm. How does that idea of the afterlife, for those who embrace an idea of the afterlife, affect what you just said?
Yeah. Well, even an afterlife, it's a discontinuity with a life. So it is not, well, you can correct me because...
Well, do we know?
Do we know?
Right,
I don't know.
Right, yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. But it's a horizon that is, horizons are kind of borders. So beyond a horizon is stuff that you can't see. And then within the horizon are things that you can see. And in a way, if you think of an afterlife, if death is a border into an afterlife, so we can ask all the sort of similar, perhaps parallel questions about what happens in the afterlife, what will it be like, what will the public be like if I'm in hell or if I'm in heaven? These will be different places. But whichever it is, it's not the same as here. It's not the same as here. Now, maybe on some ways of looking at it, on some belief systems, what will happen in the afterlife depends on what I do now. But that just takes us back to the point that having death in the background, how to deal with the fact that death is in the background, is we should deal with it by focusing on our values for how we want to live now.
All right, fair. Yep, great. So then there's this next question, which is that as a doc, I don't meet very many patients for whom death is in the background in a way that actually gives shape to their lives. So I'm going to push back a little bit, and I know you're the philosopher, and what am I? But I don't meet very many people, which is partly why I wrote the book. But I also have a concern with the book now based on reading your piece in the Gazette. So I'll get there. How is it, so you look at your average, 20-year-old, 21-year-old, and most of these folks are not really living life, making decisions based on what if they died next week, right? So even my patients in the hospital, well, for example, I had a woman in her 80s who, I'm going to change a few things just for privacy, but essentially said, I asked her about end-of-life wishes, and she said, "What are you, Dr. Death?" And I thought, well, sort of. I didn't tell her that, though. And she said, well, why is it that you think just because I'm old, I have to talk about my death? And I'm not that old. I drive a fancy sports car. And I thought, well, I have these conversations with everybody, but even folks who are quite advanced in age in our culture still aren't living with death in the background in a way. So whether we want to say it's in the background or the foreground, it doesn't seem to be having an impact. And I would say that when we do think about death, it should bring into relief that which we matter most, right? If I am a finite creature, then there is a certain urgency, even if there's an afterlife. If I'm finite in this life, there's a certain urgency to living intentionally into every day in light of my finiteness. But I have to keep that in view, and I don't think people really do, whether foreground or background.
Good. Okay, so let me clarify what I meant by background. Because I think there are different things one can mean by that. So, if you have a sort of dull pain all day, that's sort of in the background, and then once in a while you notice it, but it's always sort of there. If you're in a bad mood, that can be sort of in the background. When I talk about awareness of death in the background and the way that I think these philosophers and Rilke and a nice poem that maybe we'll have a chance to read some of, what they're talking about, I don't think it's a background in that sense. It's not like a mood. It's not like a thought that you're carrying around with you, or an after feeling of a conversation. You sort of have a nice conversation in the morning. This happens to me when I walk my dog, because it's great to walk a dog and say hi to this person and that person, and then sort of just feel good. And that's in the background of other things that I do. But that's not what they're talking about. What they are talking about is something more abstract. They're talking about the very fact of having any temporal orientation at all. And how people think about the temporal structure of their lives is very different at different ages. So if we think about young children who can't even fathom being like 11, let alone what are they going to do with their life? Let's hope they're not thinking about that. Most of them, very young aren't. Versus if you contrast sort of the opposite end and think about the types of dementia that are purely age-related, not like Alzheimer's or anything, but just the purely age-related dementias have a very different effect on people's sense of the time of how they think about the arc of their life, in that you can come to make mistakes or be unable to distinguish. Like, did something just happen yesterday, or was that like 3 months ago? So, I was talking to somebody who has this condition recently who mistook something that happened, something that actually happened 3 months ago, for something that just happened yesterday, or which times of their life they're recalling. They sort of lose track of that. And that's part of something that happens in those sorts of dementias. That's a very sort of graceful thing on one way of looking at it, where you sort of ascend or descend, depending on how you want to look at it, to gist perception. You have a sort of gist of, a gist of like, sometime in my past, whenever it was, and you lose your acuity about how long ago something happened. So that's sort of like a stepping stone on the way to eternity, where you don't anymore have such a precise temporal structure to your life. So when they talk about death being the background, all they are talking about is this very fundamental thing, that if you have any temporal structure to how you're thinking about your life or your projects, that is having death in the background. It's backgrounded because if it was foregrounded, you wouldn't even, it would all be meaningless. Your temporal structure would be meaningless and your activities would be meaningless. And that's why when people during the pandemic talked about, I lost my sense of time, I had this sort of sense of doom coming over me as this looming thing. I didn't know what was happening. I felt paralyzed. There were people dying all around me. I didn't know if that might happen to me, if that might happen to somebody I love. People's sense of time got all distorted then, because their sense of meaning got distorted. So having it in the background, it's maybe a misleading, it can be misleading if we think of that on the model of like a mood or something, because I completely agree with what you're saying. It's my sense as well that, let's hope, maybe some of you, if you're particularly interested in it, will have it in the background of your mind in the way you were describing. But when they're talking about having it in the background, it really is a sort of basic structuring fact. So anybody who has any sense of themselves in time, whether it's making mistakes like the demented person, or only seeing the sort of now and the day, that's all that matters of the young child, or whether it's the 20-something person who's sort of thinking everything I do right now is going to decide these very, very important things, for a long time to come. Those are all different ways of having death in the background, because they're all different ways of thinking of your life as having a temporal structure.
Okay, so I'm going to clarify one more time.
Okay.
I mean, I think I'm tracking with you.
Okay.
So the art of dying that I write about,
Yeah.
right? This sort of genre of literature popular for 500 years in the West that these handbooks on the preparation for death that helped people anticipate their mortality and prepare. That's neither really background material nor foreground material on this accounting. It's sort of separate category altogether.
Yes.
Would you say?
I guess. I mean, it's in a way, it's foreground in the moments that you are thinking about it. Perhaps you're thinking about it in extremely practical mode. My mom said to me, I found this plot in the cemetery. Would you like one? I was like, no, I won't think about that. I was like the person who wouldn't take the box.
No, you need to get your cemetery plot.
I got my cemetery plot.
Oh,
somehow, to me, that feels like a distraction because it's such a different orientation.
There's an economical argument, though. They only go up in price.
Okay, well, yeah, I might have made the wrong. I'll call her up after this.
Okay, all right. But no. But it's interesting. I guess so. One more question on this point: Does the threat of death, your description of COVID and people dying all around, does it matter if death results in nothingness? I mean, that is, if death were a threshold to something better, does that negate kind of what the philosophers are saying? I'm trying to use your language, but I can't really, so I need you to meet me halfway, or 60%.
I see what you're saying. So because I've been talking as if everything of meaning happens in this earthly temporality, but if you rejected that idea and you thought, actually, there's all these, even truly more wonderful things happening, however wonderful this is, which might be wonderful, that's even better on the other side, then perhaps we should become indifferent to death, or perhaps we should think, well, this was good, but then that will also be good. And that gives us a kind of peace and equanimity. So I guess, let me say, and does that force a sort of is that outlook incompatible with this idea of death as a horizon beyond which there's a sort of abyss or a nothingness or just a pure negation? Okay, I understand the question and the challenge. I think it's compatible with it in the sense of, so long as we can preserve a sort of, difference in kind between whatever kind of life or temporality there might be afterward, and whatever there is now, I think that we could still face a loss of, the earthly temporality here. And getting back to the kind of political dimension of it, one thing that can be sort of weaponized or abused in that line of thought you sketched about, well, just meet it with equanimity, it's really not so bad. I think that's a valuable thing for people, a valuable perspective for people to have, that people really rely on, importantly, when they come to it themselves. But when it's imposed on you, or when they say, well, herd immunity, or you were old anyway, or, yeah, well, you died, but okay. And you meet it with a shrug and a sigh, that I think is terrible. That I think is something we should resist if we find ourselves in the midst of political discourse that relies on that. I think that's cruelty, and that's a negation of a realm of meaning that should not be imposed on us. But I don't want to conflate those things. It's just everything. No, we often find ideas, frames that are very good, but also can be abused. You find that all the time, and this is just an example of that.
Well, so. Forgive me, just one more minute. So I've been lecturing a lot lately on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, and particularly with the Canadian context, medical assistance in dying, where more than 10,000 people were euthanized last year in Canada, 1,721 for loneliness, 537 folks with disabilities who weren't able to have their disability needs met in Canada elected euthanasia. So as a physician, this is an issue that's coming more and more to the fore. And so when I read your really wonderful piece in the Harvard Gazette, I started thinking about even my own work differently, because you write, and I think this is where you were going with your remarks just now, you're quoted as talking about the need for political leaders to approach conversations about death with a sort of gravitas, right? With a sobriety, that the dignity of human life, in a sense, you don't use that language, but that it demands, right? That human life demands that we talk about death in a way that is very respectful. And that if we don't do that, we lose something. And then I was thinking, wow, I do all this work on the preparation for death. We need to talk about death. We don't have to arrive at equanimity. We can be afraid sort of all the way. I read about this. Some people are afraid sort of all the way through. But we need to keep death in the conversation. And yet, there's a way in which if death is too much in the conversation, it gets cheapened. And then life is cheapened. And even people who are in favor of legalization of physician-assisted suicide in the United States are a little bit nervous about what's going on in Canada right now. And so I wonder if you would just indulge me for a second and reflect on the kind of Canadian experiment. And one other point on this, we know that in jurisdictions where physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal, there is a concomitant increase in conventional suicide. So that is what's happening, right? The conversation about death and being able to take one's own life, whether it's doctor sanctioned, state sanctioned, or you do it yourself, that becomes so ubiquitous why would you not? And so I just wonder, so I found myself struggling as I was thinking through reading your piece and thinking about this talk. Well, how do we, or where is the line? I want my patients to prepare for death. I want the students to think about their mortality. They'll make different decisions. If you know that time is limited, and you just even reflect on that for a second, you'll make different decisions about why you live and what you do and what matters. You just will. So I think that's but we also don't want to sort of slip over the line where life then becomes disposable at a whim. And the public conversation, sort of from the top down, is one where that's okay. They're elderly, and you know what? It saves healthcare dollars, right? And that is what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of callousness when the decision is made. The decision is made for you. I think those are the clearest cases of callousness. The hard cases, and we did see that in the pandemic. And people should rightly take offense or feel indignant if the people, if a government that's supposed to be, in charge of our safety and protecting us, suddenly treats us as if we are dispensable, then that's government not doing its basic job of governing. Now, the hard cases are this line of thought you're mentioning, which is, suppose you have sort of the affordance or the possibility of doing something, and then, it becomes an option on the radar that might not have been there if it was illegal. And I don't know what to think about that. One reaction I do have, though, is that when I think about where in the public sphere, in the range of different political phenomena that we face, where do we find the most powerful forces that are cheapening life? It strikes me that it's not in medical health policy or assisted suicide. It strikes me that it's in political move. It strikes me that it's in gun violence, to be frank, where we're just supposed to take it. We're just supposed to say, well, another school shooting, I guess your kindergartner is going to have to learn how to hide under the desk because that's the price of somebody else exercising their freedom. You're just going to have to die. To me, that is, an epidemic. It's a political problem. That's where I see the cheapening of life in a much larger scale than these health policy things. But I completely take the point that it's an extremely difficult question. I'm glad we have ethicists like you looking at it of what should we think about? And of course, people say similar things about abortion. If it's a possibility, then will people sort of think of it the wrong way or whatever? And one thing I guess I will say about both of those cases is that at least there are structures, where there's discussion, where there's reflection. Nobody takes those things lightly. Nobody does, and nobody really can. So the threat that people are going to cheapen it just because this policy is available, I feel that that's a sort of distorted abstraction in a way. Whereas like someone might barge into Michigan State or Cambridge or someplace else and take someone's life just because, for whatever reason, because they can. And when we ask these questions of what was their motive, as opposed to asking how could they do it, how was it possible, why was it possible for that to happen, to me that's a sort of bigger threat. Now that's not an answer to the question, and I don't like it sometimes when people say you're asking this question, but what about that question? But I do think that sometimes if we're trying to assess where should we focus our attention if we're worried about cheapening of life, then I think it is fair to say we should focus on, gun violence or the politics of strong men who try to stoke fear and then say, only I can protect you from it, more than we should focus on health policy. When we are focusing on health policy, we should make sure that whenever we're adjacent to death, wherever we're adjacent to questions about life, we have the supports we need for people to think it through and come to it clear-eyed and come to it with people like you, doctors like you, who are, not just sort of treating the body, but treating the human situation.
Yeah,
that's
thanks.
how I think of it. You're not getting a word in edgewise.
Sorry, I'll be done.
No, this was great. I do wonder, Dr. Dugdale, if you could kind of maybe touching on your research in the art of dying well, give us at least a historical perspective for a continent, Europe, that went through a pandemic that wiped out 2/3 of the population. How did that influence the way they thought about whether they should think about death? How did that experience of mass death change their approach to even thinking about dying?
Yeah. So this is kind of what my work is on, but so I was puzzled as a young doctor, how do we help patients prepare for death? And I was sort of reading everything I could, trying to think through this. There has to be a model, there has to be a way. I read all the books that all the doctors wrote on this, couldn't find anything that was really helpful. And then I had this really there was this very brief comment about the ars moriendi, Latin for art of dying. Again, this genre of literature. And this genre developed, it didn't just sort of develop on its own. The instigation was the bubonic plague outbreak of the mid-1300s, which, as you said, historians estimate that perhaps as many as 2/3 of the population was wiped out. Now, I think there's some variance, but even in earlier and later iterations of the plague, in some urban areas, the town records report 50-60% of the population wiped out. So the fact that in some jurisdictions, at least between 1/3 and 2/3 died is incredible. Now, if you think about COVID for a second, and it was, less than 0.3% of the population, right? Which is not to minimize. I was a frontline COVID doctor in New York. It was horrible. And we had, trucks, semi-trucks parked all over New York City that just had bodies in them, refrigerated trucks full of bodies, of corpses. So it was horrible, but this is a tiny percentage of the population. What if it was 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3? I mean, where do the bodies go, right? And so as society sort of emerged, Western Europe emerged from this outbreak of plague, it had to rebuild itself. I mean, what was left? What was left of the social structures? The social structure in late Middle Ages in Western Europe was really the church. And this is before you get the Protestant Reformation. So it's really the Western church that was the social authority. Were there minority religions? Absolutely. There were other groups. There were non-religious people, sure. But this was the dominant authority. And so the people who survived, many of them were concerned that their loved ones who died were burning somewhere in hell, right? Because they weren't buried properly. They didn't get the last rites or the anointing of the sick. They didn't get the rituals and the proper burials, the religious attendance that they were supposed to get. And so who knows now? Where are all these people? So the survivors of the plague then turned to their social authorities, the priests who survived, and said, all right, we need some help in preparing for death, because death is going to come back. If it's not plague, it's going to be war, it's going to be famine. Death is a fact of life, and that's the way people lived really until about 100 years ago, really until antibiotics, right, which was the late 20s. And really it was the 40s when antibiotics became a thing. So it's only been in the last 100 years that death kind of became optional. And then we had the concomitant rise of the hospital, and so people are no longer seeing the dead. How many of you have cared for someone as they're dying? Okay, 6, 7, 8? It would have been everybody 100 years ago. Everybody would have been with someone to the end. So we think about this kind of, is it a modern project then to keep death in the background, right? So anyway, there's this kind of cry on the part of the survivors, we need some help. One of the reasons I was attracted to the ars moriendi is because I will tell you, I think my fellow physicians are pretty terrible at telling patients when they're dying. Some of them are quite good at it. They tend to go into palliative care. But the fact that doctors have now outsourced difficult conversations to a subspecialist in medicine is pretty pathetic, but that's the state of medicine today. Somebody's dying? Call the doctors who deal with death. We don't, and it used to be that every doctor had these conversations 100 years ago, until 100 years. So I was interested in the ars moriendi as a model because it was empowering of individuals and their communities, because living as with dying is always a community activity, right? We're relational creatures. We need to walk the dog and run into the neighbors. We need to have meals together. And that's part of being human, is to be in relationship. But part of living then, and also part of dying, is to die in relationship. And so I love this idea of empowering individuals in the context of their communities to think about what it means to die well, and then by extension, what it means to live well, because the two are very much intertwined. Is that what you wanted me to say?
That was great.
Okay.
On a related but separate note, maybe focusing more on, okay, we've thought about how should we think about death, whether we should think about it background, foreground. Now, how does finitude that death provides give meaning to our life, and how should it shape or inform the things that we value and choose to do? And that can start with either one.
You start with this one because I already said a thing about this.
So any of you who have known someone who's had a bad diagnosis starts thinking about their life very differently, right? I have a best friend from childhood. We've been very close since the age of 10. And on Super Bowl Sunday, she texted me to say, I'm in the intensive care unit. I'm not sure what's going to happen. She's not touchy-feely, lovey-dovey at all. But she said, just in case I die, I want you to know that I love you. And that's, to hear from her, something that I've never heard her say before, also sort of made it clear to me that she was in a bad way. And she had some major health stuff. And fortunately, I think is going to be okay. But those diagnoses, those moments, those kind of wake-up calls, put things into perspective. And I don't think we want to go through life, sort of, maybe unless you're a poet, hoping for drama and tragedy so that you kind of constantly put your life in focus, right? I don't know that we want to wish for that, but is there a way that we can kind of have the end in view and make better decisions? So I don't know how many of you realized that yesterday was Ash Wednesday. Did you see some people with like the smudges? So I went to Ash Wednesday service last night. I'm a practicing Christian, and went to Ash Wednesday service, and the liturgy is kind of all doom and gloom, right? I mean, it's a lot of doom and gloom. Death to sin, death to self. It's really all about death. And why is it all about death? Well, it's only all about death because it's the preparation for Christians for the 40 days of fasting and sort of restitution as they approach Easter. That's what Lent is about. And Ash Wednesday is kind of the kickoff. That's why you have Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras on Tuesday, right? Party, 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 and then, the ashes and death and this season of preparation. So I was sitting there last night thinking, I probably should have been listening to the priest, but I was thinking about tonight's event and thinking, if there's no resurrection, right, this is pretty bad. Why would you have a day set aside, from dust you came, to dust you will return? You are mortal, you're human, you are going to turn into ash, and then have the ash smudged on your forehead, and then I got it on my fingernails. And why would you do that if there's no resurrection? And so then, I was just kind of thinking about what does death make clear for us? Because if there's nothing, then it can be total. I mean, it is always disruptive, as you said really eloquently, Susanna. But yeah. So I mean, in my book, I was really taken. There's a professor here at Harvard, John Levinson, who writes on Jewish conceptions of the resurrection in the first century. This was before Christians came on the scene and had their conception of the resurrection. But there was this conception of the resurrection that in the last days, all of the faithful will be resurrected. And there's some disagreement among the first century Jewish leaders. Is it all the Jewish faithful, or is there going to be a general resurrection of the dead of everybody? And then you have Jesus, the Jewish man, dies and is resurrected, and that sort of turns on the Christian accounting, right? That sort of turns the tables on what this conception of the resurrection is. But anyway, if there's nothing, I once was in conversation with a philosopher at Yale, Shelley Kagan. Do you know Shelley? Yeah, and he's like, the body is like a lamp. When it's broken, it's done, right? You know, like, you're done. Throw it away. And I love him. He's so great. He's so great. But that's a different way to think about it. And is that okay? Does that give us peace? Yeah, anyway, that's, I don't know.
Can I say something about this?
Oh, please.
So, okay, I think, like, you know, one doesn't, I'm a philosopher, I'm a philosopher for a living, which is amazing. I'm so grateful that I get to be a philosopher for a living. But even a philosopher for a living, like, nobody, not even a philosophy professor, spends all their time reflecting. You know, nobody does that. It's like you reflect and then you engage for a little while, and then you reflect and you engage for a little while. So when we talk about bringing death out of the background, there's two very, very different ways to do that. And I think they've both emerged in different things you said tonight. So one sort of way you do it is like to have the frank conversations about practicalities and emotions that come up when somebody is thinking about the end of their life or the end of somebody else's life who they love, who they know. That's one way to bring it to the foreground. Another different way of bringing it to the foreground is potentially more disruptive, and almost kind of pulls in the opposite direction, but it's a stepping stone to reflection. You know, your friend texted you, she made explicit something that had only been implicit. So death, the prospect of it, was an occasion for reflection and expression. But we're not constantly, and there are other stepping stones to the same thing. An ethics class, a frank talk with a friend, a dream, you know, a sort of quiet sitting where you're talking, as D.H. Lawrence says in one part, talking to a skeleton. There's a great little essay by D.H. Lawrence called Talking to My Skeleton. And he's like, why do people not want to talk to their skeleton? And it's anyway just about sort of, okay, reflection. Now, I mean, we don't live our lives to like reflecting all the time. We have various occasions on which things come into focus. And what should come into focus in those moments is what we care about, what we value. Sometimes when one is an existential crisis or a crisis of value, they ask what they value, but they are not sure what it is. And they don't sure how to figure out what it is. And they're, you know, have to figure out what can guide me in thinking it through. And then there are various things they can try to help with that. So, but those are moments of reflection that you go through. They're uncomfortable, but you go through that so that then you can stop reflecting and go about your business. And so, you know, the idea that death shouldn't always be in the foreground is partly the idea that it might be a stepping stone to reflection, but you're not always reflecting. It's not like you should sort of constantly be thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die there for this. It's more that you do that so that you come to a settled idea of how to live. And so it's a kind of, and you don't have to, that's not the only way to come to that idea. You don't have to do it via death, but you can do it via death. And that's sort of different way of doing it via death than talking about practicalities. Perhaps talking about, you know, do you want that? Would you like a gravesite next to me on my left or my right? You know, or you know, your box or whatever. That's probably not going to lead to the occasion for reflection. Whereas your friend's, you know, your friend's situation is.
Yeah, actually, one of our attendees also asked, quote, I've wondered about death before and what it would be like if I died and how. It's scary to me, the idea of inexistence, of literally losing my consciousness into oblivion, never to be reclaimed again. And my heart literally plummets when I think about this. I suppose I'd like to know how we can overcome this fear of death. And on that vein, of course, death is just not just an academic subject, but very deeply personal to all of us, and often scary to think about. How do you, as individuals, process the reality of your own death? Mortality.
Two questions there. So one question was, if I think about death, that, you know, that the person who wrote in, and I hope you're here, hi, whoever you are, you know, who said, it's a sort of oblivion and that's terrifying. How could I not be terrified? I mean, I would say you should be terrified. I mean, that is terrifying. But understand the terms of the terror, the terms of the fear. The terms of the fear is, what would you be losing? What are you losing in losing that? You are losing all of the things that give your meaning. You're losing all of your temporal structures and everything that can fill those structures. And that is terrifying. And the way to face it is not to lose the terror or not to say, oh, it's not such a big deal. But the way to lose it is to figure out, well, how do I want to fill those structures? With what do I want to fill those structures? If you think of it in terms of calling, you know, what was I put on earth to do? Or what should I do? And how should I act? And how do I want to be in relationship with people? So it's a stepping stone again. And it won't lose the terror, it won't lose the fear. But another thing one can leverage in facing that fear is understanding the kinds of losses that other people have when people they are close to die, or when someone's left on the sidewalk, what it means that someone leaves the body on the sidewalk, for several hours before doing anything about it, and what kind of civic disregard that is. So that's a way of appreciating the value of life through that fear. So I think that's valuable. There was a second question, but I'll let you speak your first question first.
Sure. I hope, well, I'm not sure if you were saying that we should try to find a calling, if part of what you said was we should try to find a calling that could displace the fear, because I don't think we want to displace it. I think we want to hang out in that space. Right. So I quote one poet, Chris Wyman, who talks about walking toward the fear and sadness. There's a way in which when we hang out with things that fundamentally make us uncomfortable, we start seeing them in a new way. It doesn't mean the fear goes away completely, but it might make us reassess the situation. I think this is true with people that you think you really aren't gonna like, right? I mean, you see that person and they did something really weird, and then you find yourself in a study group with them, right? We've had these experiences, but the more you sort of sit with that person, you realize their humanity, their quirkiness, what makes them tick, right? And I think there's a way in which that experience can be true with death. At least, there's so much to say. Very quickly, in California, when they legalized physician-assisted suicide, they gave, one study gave people the option, people who wanted lethal drugs to end their lives, half of them had the option of being able to speak with a licensed clinical social worker about their death anxiety. So one half got to counseling, and the other half just got to talk to the doctor and get the drugs. And of those who talked about their death anxiety, half of them left without wanting any further lethal drugs. What they really wanted was to be able to talk about their fears. So there's a way in which when things make us uncomfortable, if we kind of approximate ourselves to them, they become a little less scary. But I think there also raises the possibility of asking, this is a space for reflection and not action, then maybe, like, what is making me uncomfortable? Am I settled in my views of death? Like, am I a convinced materialist that actually my body is like a lamp? When I'm dead, I'm done. You can throw me out in the trash. Am I convinced, or is my discomfort because I'm not settled on my metaphysical sort of perspectives on death, right? And so I think that discomfort can open up, when we approximate ourselves to that discomfort, to that fear, it can open up the possibility for inquiry and for asking questions and reading. And goodness gracious, there's been tons written on this subject for millennia. So it creates possibility.
Death has been around for a long time. Yeah. This is why I didn't read any pregnancy books. I'm like, people have been doing this for a long time. I figure like.
And then we were unfair. We did technically ask you 2 questions. And so to close off the moderated conversation part of the evening, before we go to question and response, how do you as individuals process the reality of your own mortality and death?
You check the yes box.
I check the yes box. I've been checking the yes box since I was a little kid. I'm pretty comfortable talking about it. And I think theologically, having a framework, being raised in a tradition that gives meaning to life, that doesn't stop at physical death, right? The Kierkegaardian notion of death as a threshold, I think has resonance with me. Have I ever died? No. Do I know what awaits me? No. But is the possibility of, C.S. Lewis in the last of the Chronicles of Narnia the non-chronological version. It talks about, he has this description of the sort of, I don't even know, is it heaven or the new heavens, right, and new earth, as being just like the most beautiful thing that you ever seen on earth, but only better, right? There's this sort of way in which it's a great story. It's a great story, and it has resonance, and so I think that I would, one of the places in which we can sit with our discomfort with death, we can ask, is there a more compelling story? I think that's a question worth considering.
When I think about mortality, I guess I tend to focus more on other people's death than mine. So in the political scale, and I think, when a leader kind of sends their citizens to die, for their own, on poor grounds when it's not an honorable war. I think about their mortality, and I think about the political significance of that. When I think about the killings at the hands of the police and the perversity of that, and what it means to have a sort of large-scale kind of disregard for life in those contexts. Then I think about the people close to me, and I think about their death a lot more than I think about mine.
You're avoiding.
Those things are very important, I think, and perhaps it's easier. Perhaps they're doing the same for me. Maybe they'll think about me, and I'll think about them, and it'll all come out even. Yeah, but I read this poem a lot. I read this Rilke poem. Can I read this Rilke poem? Okay, so this is an amazing poem. It's called Death, and the thing is that I want to read you some of it in German, but then I'll read it in English, because you can hear it. It's one of these poems where you can really hear it in both languages, and you can't really translate poetry, but this is a great translation. Okay, so, Der Tod, that's German. Da steht der Tod, ein bläulicher Absud in einer Tasse ohne Untersatz. Now I'm going to read you the English. There stands death, a bluish concoction in a cup without a saucer. An odd place for a cup, standing on the back of a hand. One can still easily recognize on the glazed side the crack in the cup, dusty, and hope in faded letters on its bulge. That had the drinker whom this drink concerns read at a distant breakfast. So what beings, then, are those that one must at last scare away with poison? Would they otherwise stay? Are they then here besotted with this meal full of obstacle? One must take out this hard presence like an artificial denture. Then they would mumble, mumble, mumble. O falling star, seen once from a bridge, do not forget yourself. Stand. Now I want to read it in German. Okay, because I think you can feel it. It's going to sink in even more. Okay. Da steht der Tod, ein bläulicher Absud in einer Tasse ohne Untersatz. So Absud, this is why it's a brilliant translation, because how do you translate that word? Concoction, as opposed to essence or, what's that word? Doesn't matter. Anyway, that's the brilliant translation. Da steht der Tod, ein bläulicher Absud in einer Tasse ohne Untersatz. Ein wunderlicher Platz für eine Tasse steht auf dem Rücken einer Hand. Ganz gut erkennt man noch an dem glasierten Schwung den Bruch des Henkels, staubig, und Hoffnung an ihrem Bug in aufgebrauchter Schrift. Das hat der Trinker, den der Trank trifft, bei einem fernen Frühstück abgelesen. Was sind das für Wesen, die man zuletzt wegschrecken muss mit Gift? Blieben sie sonst? Sind sie denn hier vernaten dieses Essen voller Hindernis? Man muss ihnen die harte Gegenwart ausnehmen, wie ein künstliches Gebiss. Dann lallen sie. Gelal, o Sternenfall, von einer Brücke einmal eingesehen, dich nicht vergessen, stehen. When I think about my death, I just read this poem.
Thank you very much, Rohan. So now, audience, this is your moment. If there's questions that you'd like to ask our speakers, Rohan will be coming around with the mic, so just please raise your hand, and we will try to get to a number of you.
Okay, I guess I can stand up. Hi, so thank you guys for, having this event and speaking, I guess, pretty openly about this topic. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone really speak this openly about a topic like this before. But anyway, so I feel like kind of at the beginning, one of you guys mentioned this idea of like death as like one of the few human universals. But so something that I think runs kind of perpendicular to that is like two things come to mind. One is like religion and like the role that plays in terms of, I guess, both between different religions. Like some have, the resurrection, some have like cycles of reincarnation versus people who like aren't sure what's out there, or maybe there's like no God, nothing controlling, I guess, all of this. So I guess that's one thing. And another thing is, I guess, more broadly, just like cultural conceptions. Like, I don't know if we want to make this sort of dichotomy, but like Western versus Eastern, like philosophies or like conceptions of death, and I guess also what that means for life. So yeah, I guess kind of two questions in one, like religion broadly, culture broadly. So if you guys could speak more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Thank you. Certainly different religions have different perspectives on what happens, right? I think all religions, all of the major world religions have some sort of mystery around the interface between life and death. There's something there. What is it? It's defined differently. And even cultural expressions of what a good dying process might look like, or a good death, those vary. And we see, I practice medicine in New York City. We have so many different cultural groups represented among our patients. And so we do have to be prepared as docs to kind of modify what our conception is of a good dying process. Do we even tell the patient she has cancer? In some cultures, absolutely not. In some cultures, you only talk through the adult children to relay information. I mean, there's lots of different ways that happens. We try to accommodate different preferences for different kinds of rituals or religious leaders who might come in and facilitate the dying process. I guess what I will say is that when we talk about our discomfort with death, and I say sort of hang out in that space, I think it's important for people to read deeply and widely about what different approaches are, what different answers are to these questions. My hope is that people would kind of undertake their own sort of searching process. And this is something that I advocate for with my patients. I can't give my patients a prescription for what they should believe about the afterlife, right? But I can certainly encourage them to do their homework. Because at the end of the day, the doctor is not the priest or the imam, or you're right, the doctor is not that figure. But I have had enough patients face their dying process with a lot of existential fear, because they have tried to put off thoughts of mortality and have also then put off sort of addressing these religious questions. So my kind of, part of my argument for what it means to live well then is to wrestle with these questions, wrestle with them now. You're never too young to wrestle with what you believe and what that impact of your belief system as you sort of think through it and develop it might be on your living and your dying.
One of my, I didn't grow up with this tradition, but one tradition that I've made use of sort of as an adopted tradition is the Day of the Dead rituals from Mexico. And I just love the aspect of them where you can sort of communicate with people, leave out their favorite foods. And when my daughter was very young, she noticed that there was this graveyard right next to Market Basket in Union Square in Somerville. We used to go a lot. And she said, "Mama, if you ever die, you should be buried in that graveyard, because right across from the place with Momo's, and it's right by Union Square Donuts, and it's by Market Basket." I'm like, yeah, that's a spirit. First I love the if you ever die. But that's the idea, that you could sort of communicate. I mean, I lost my mother-in-law, and I think about her all the time. I bring her to life all the time in my mind and with her voice. And she was German, so this, through this poem and just the idea that someone could do that for me leave out a donut for me, leave out my favorite things at Market Basket, which you got on a bargain. It's a great grocery store, Market Basket. Things like that. I think that's a kind of, so it's not exactly an afterlife, but it does speak to the, that none of that challenges a sort of background, blah, blah, blah. It's just that, okay, here's this day where we remember the kind of rapport we had. So.
Time for one final question. So.
Hi, thank you for the discussion so far. My question is, so how do you create these spaces and like conversations among like people that you care about death, especially if it's like something that we should ponder?
That one's for you.
I wrote an article once making a pitch for Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving is a day when everyone's feasting and enjoying life and together with loved ones and friends and family. And then Black Friday is the day when you sort of go shopping, right? And part of shopping is living well. So this article I wrote, I pitched that at the end of your day of living well, right? You're with your friends and family. Maybe you should talk about death. And maybe every Black Friday, we should just like talk about preparation for death. It was kind of tongue-in-cheek, and I published it on Black Friday. But we have to incorporate it into some sort of rhythm, right? So, I would suggest. I mean, Professor Siegel might not want us to, but I would suggest that we have to incorporate it into some sort of rhythm, and that might be going to the doctor. Right? Your doctor's appointments help bring that into relief. It might be some sort of festival days, right? Whatever your particular cultural or religious tradition might be, where there's an opportunity to reflect on these sorts of things. There's zillions of books written on the subject, and so there's lots of possibilities. There are data that show that sort of the baby boomer generation would rather talk to their adult children about sex than talk to their aging parents about death. So we still have a lot of cultural reluctance. So there's not going to be one answer to how it could build into your rhythms. I'll tell you, I've been writing on this stuff for a long time, a lot of articles, a couple of books. My parents have read it all. And my mother still doesn't want to talk about death. So you also can't force people, and that's okay. She's going to live to be 120, and then we'll deal with it then. So you can't force people, but creating opportunities is the way. There are things like death cafes that are common in urban centers. I'm sure there's one in Cambridge. I'm sure there's one in Boston. I think it's fine. It's a fine idea as far as it goes. A lot of people who like to talk about death get together over drinks. I think probably a smaller group of folks who might share, whether it's family or cultural or religious beliefs to kind of work through this, or philosophers who like to talk about death. I think it's important to find people with whom to have these conversations. But but what is a conversation about death, right? I mean, some of it is how do you sit with it? What kind of values and beliefs do you have? But I think more importantly, the question is how do we want to live in light of the fact that out there is our finitude somewhere, in light of the fact that at some point we will die, but that's not the point of fixation. The point of is what does that then mean for our living? And how do we live into today in light of that? So, yeah.
I think that's a good last word.
Okay, well, please give a big round of applause.